All right, super, excellent. Let's get underway. Thanks everyone for joining. I feel a bit like one of those parliamentarians that you see sometimes in a media conference, where you occasionally get the wide-angled view of the room they're speaking to, and you thought it'd be packed with reporters and really dynamic. But here at the Fenner School, there are a couple of people in the audience, so thanks for joining physically. And I think there are a few people online, which is great. So I'm just going to talk probably for 20-25 minutes or so and give heaps of time for questions and Q&A, etc. So my name's Dave Shearer. Prior to becoming a very mature age PhD student here at Fenner, I spent about 15 years in the international agricultural research space. So I spent some time working for Asia, which is a small Australian government agency, the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, that funds principally bilateral research partnerships between Australian organisations and developing country partners. And then I spent some time in the CGIR, which when Tony Fisher joined, maybe it used to be the Consultative Group for International Agricultural Research. It's now just legally known by that acronym. So and all cultures have these acronyms. So I spent some time working for World Fish, based in Penang in Malaysia, and that was really running the sort of global operations of the organisation. And prior to starting my PhD this year, I spent about 14 months working officially with IMI, the International Water Management Institute, but embedded within a program within IMI called Water, Land and Ecosystems, and more specifically with the Commission for Sustainable Ag Intensification. And so today, really what I wanted to do is just give you a little bit of insight for what the Commission did, the Commission for Sustainable Ag Intensification. So so what I want to do in terms of that insight from the Commission, and I'll tell you a little bit more about the Commission in the next slide. I want to look at the current sort of investment that occurs in innovation in agri-food systems, think a little bit, or hopefully prompt a little bit of thinking about the balance within that portfolio of investment in innovation, and then really think about what's happening in terms of some of that rebalancing of the portfolio, and then really some ideas that were generated by the Commission. So this isn't really my work. I'm just pulling together a collective group of work that happened for the Commission. So hopefully this little bit of structure, I'm just wanting it to be sort of interesting for people and stimulate a bit of thought. I'm not proposing that I know the solutions in terms of the investment in innovation and how that occurs most effectively, but I do know that collectively we have to pursue it. Now, Tony in the audience may not like this, but my view of the CGIR, when you work in the CGIR, and contribute to international agricultural research, a lot of your focus is on how technology and driving the implementation of technology and the innovations that happen in that space can resolve lots of the world's issues. And principally, the CGIR and the work of the Commission was focused around global food security. So those with a SDG bent, that's SDG 2. But as we become a much more complex space, the CG really realises, and I guess we all start to realise, that addressing these quite complex issues in sort of a linear way, only with technology innovation, limits the impact that you're able to have. And so the Commission tried to unpack this a little bit by not just looking at innovation around technology, but looked at innovation in policy and in financing and in institutional development. Now, I can't give you all the insights that were sort of gleaned by the Commission, so I've just tried today just to pull out a couple of relevant ones for the subject matter in terms of this balanced portfolio. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of more insight to the Commission, Commissions are really established to unpack new areas of endeavour. So they bring together a collective group of people to really gain some insight into this new area. Now, as is stated there, it was the Commission for Sustainable Ag Intensification. It actually started life as the Commission for Sustainable Agriculture. Now, those in the agricultural space know those two terms are slightly different and evoke different images about what we mean from a sustainable agricultural point of view. But I suspect if the Commission had its time again and looked back at what it was able to achieve, it really would become the Commission for Innovation Investment in Future Agri-Food Systems, in my view. So the scope and mandate of the Commission really broadened and expanded whilst it was operating. But at the heart of what it was trying to do was to uncover and unpack ways that globally we can invest not only more, but better in innovation to improve future agri-food systems. Better in terms of the SDGs, particularly SDG 2, but also importantly in terms of the impact agriculture and agri-food systems make on the climate, and more importantly, the contribution they may have to future climate scenarios. But the thing that I wanted to point out about the Commission is that it was made up of entirely from commissioners from the Global South. And so that brought a perspective, or meant that there was a perspective really being drawn from the Global South, from developing economies in terms of both in Africa, in Asia, and in Latin America. And it was quite interesting, and there's a little bit of insight here in terms of the different contexts in those different agri-food systems. None of these people would, well, maybe a couple of them, would suggest that they're experts in sustainable ag intensification. Some of them would suggest that they're experts in terms of investment in innovation, but they came together collectively to produce this portfolio of evidence that the Commission hope and we hope will drive a different kind of investment in the future for agri-food systems. So I just wanted to, now that I've sort of explained a little bit of my background and a little bit of where the Commission was coming from, just to start contextualising what I want to say with a couple of numbers. So in 2021, there was the UNFSS, the United Nations Food Systems Summit, which has sort of been and gone, and in my view hasn't really created lasting impact. Now that's only my opinion. I guess it's tried to focus some of the efforts needed to transform future food systems at the national level. But in the lead up to the UNFSS, one of the pieces of evidence that came out was about the cost and benefit of the global agri-food system, and reiterating, I guess, that the food system is costing us more than it benefits us. And really those costs are primarily from the health implications, both in terms of obesity and malnutrition, and as importantly, the negative consequences from a climate change perspective as well. And so that was really quite a powerful message in terms of the agri-food system that we're all involved with. And then just to put up perhaps a number of other irrelevant bits of information, but just to really sort of think through this area around investing in innovation. From a mitigation point of view in climate change, there's been an estimate of needing to spend about 400 billion annually in agriculture, forestry and other land use, so a massive amount of money, but a very small amount of money currently being invested in this space. Even less from an adaptation point of view. So that's really just the work on mitigation. But then the World Bank also describes the benefits of investing in this green economy and in transformation. And they're suggesting overall in all economies, there's a 1-to-4 cost benefit ratio. So it just makes you, all I'm trying to do here is just make you think about not only the importance of this investment in innovation, but also what might be some of the limitations. If we have these strong economic drivers, produced by the World Bank, etc. But we also have significant limitations as well. So now I want to turn attention just a little bit in terms of the current climate change situation, and I'm going to refer to the IPCC Working Group 3 report that's just come out in terms of mitigation. And the reason I want to do this is that the work that's been done internationally and nationally in innovation and technology has been really powerful in terms of feeding the world. And overall, with the occasional blip, as we're seeing at the moment, we've seen a general downturn in the cost of food, particularly commodity-based, and the CG and other international centres have played a significant role, primarily driven through productivity growth. And so, there's been a massive effort and a huge amount of success since the Green Revolution in terms of a downward trend in terms of cost of food and, importantly, the contribution it makes to reducing hunger. However, when we look at the contribution agriculture makes in terms of a climate context, I think it starts to change our views. Now, you would all be quite familiar with, the increased level of emissions, both in terms of carbon dioxide and other gases, which I'll just refer to in a minute. But the thing I wanted to point out here is that this is the level of emissions that have grown. And I guess one of the things that have come out of the IPCC report recently is the last 10 years have seen a slowing of emissions compared to the previous 10 years, but still going up. But here we see about 64% of emissions coming from fossil fuel and industry. Now, if we change tact a little bit and just look at the contribution those emissions make to climate change, global warming, etc., you can see that that contribution of CO2 from the energy sector is coming down to about a third, where the contribution from those other areas, so carbon dioxide from land use change, basically, methane and nitrous oxide, a much more significant contribution. Now, primarily, these emissions come from the agricultural sector. And so it's really important in terms of innovation when we look at this is not only has innovation been effective in addressing food security and contributing to SDG 2, but as we move forward, we must ensure that innovation is effective in addressing some of these future challenges. Before I move on, I do want to point out too that, perhaps I'll just move to the next slide. The other thing that was highlighted in that IPCC report is that, sure, at the moment, the majority of contributions in terms of climate change is coming from CO2. But from the years 2050 to 2100, the vast majority of gases contributing to climate change will come from methane and nitrous oxide. Now, they're the main gases, emissions from agri-food systems. So let's put that into context. We're in 2022, and by 2050, those agriculturally related emissions will be a much more significant contributor. The other thing that I wanted to point out is that from an agricultural perspective, the time taken for innovation, technology innovation, to come out of the research area and to have a maximum level of impact, even in a developed economy, is about 30 years. Okay, so it's a long lag time between when innovation occurs at the sort of scientific research level compared to its maximum use within agricultural systems. So if you combine those two things, it's about 30 years until those agricultural emissions are having the most significant contribution to climate change. And it takes about 30 years to get the maximisation of effect of innovations. It's at this point that we really need to start driving those contributions. And I guess from my point of view, it's getting that investment in innovation now that's really critical to look at those changes in the future. So in terms of, just wrapping up that section, we've really seen innovation driving particular changes, successfully feeding the world, having a contribution to reducing poverty, etc., engaging people with markets. But there's also been a cost of that, a cost in terms of the contribution it makes from a climate change perspective. And if you're looking at some of those changes, those costs may become, greater as we look to future changes in agri-food systems. So now I want to so that was a little bit of context. Now I want to switch to some of the evidence drawn out by the Commission. And the thing that I want to do is just look at the current sort of landscape of investment in innovation across the globe. Now, the first thing I'll do is I'll just touch on total agricultural expenditure across the globe. And I'll touch on this in a later slide as well. So this is the investment principally made by national governments. And here in Australia, it's about $2 billion a year to support the agricultural sector. The thing to sort of take into account, and I guess remember from this slide, is that if I was to use academic words, it'd be geospatially variable, I think is what I would use. I'm not an academic, so I'll just say it differs a bit in different countries. Okay, but we're seeing significant areas of investment in China, and we're seeing investments in areas such as India and Brazil, and some of those are having implications. I will turn in a little while in terms of the policy investment that's occurring, and please remember this slide to indicate the level of investment. So if we take that overall expenditure and we look at the investment that's going in innovation, and so this is where the Commission started its work. It sort of developed up a baseline level of understanding of where the investment in innovation is coming from. I guess the highlight from the Commission's point of view, and remember the Commission was funded by development partners and had mainly worked in that development space. What was really insightful here is that national governments of developing economies play a critical role in investing in innovation. Now, this is a little distorted by this previous slide because the vast amount of that investment, about 50% of investment by national governments, is actually made by China. So there's a couple of countries that are the big investors in innovation, and then there's a long, long tail of the rest of investment in terms of the investment being made by national governments. But the other important thing, and I guess the thing that I'm really interested in as well, is the investment by private sector. Now, as I work through this, I'm actually really keen to link together private sector and what the researchers described as private equity. The way that you should look at this is that private sector is the investment coming from within value chains. So the big companies such as Syngenta, Bayer, John Deere, etc., in terms of innovation, principally being driven by innovations in inputs, technology inputs. But also, and a much more growing and dynamic sector, is what they refer to as private equity. Now, my view is you just look at this as money coming from outside the value chain, but private money coming from outside the value chain. And if you look at that funding over the last 10 years, that's the highest rate of growth from that sector. So really important as we look at innovation and innovation investment in developing economies to drive the transformation of agri-food systems is that that private sector investment, both from within the value chains and outside. However, there were two important features that I guess this drew out. Firstly, the rate of investment in innovation is about 4.5% of agricultural GDP. Now, the renewables sector, which is making significant changes in terms of its contribution to changing its contribution to emissions, invests at about 6%. So 6% of energy GDP is invested into renewables, and only about 4.5% of agricultural GDP is invested in innovation. Now, if we were to grow that to about the same level of renewables, which is, what I'm advocating is that Agriculture is a key part of, climate change, becoming more significant in terms of its future contribution. So we need to be upping our game in terms of that level of investment. We'd have an additional 20 billion across the sector if we were to up our ante. But perhaps more importantly is when this research was done, it looked at both the economic, environmental, and social contributions that it's made. Now, it does differ a little bit across the different investment categories, okay? But in the main and across the board on average, only about 7% of the total investment in innovation goes to specific environmental outcomes, and only about half of that goes to social outcomes. So things like driving change within the contribution to climate change or around nutritional outcomes, etc. There's just not enough investment into that space. Now, so that was on average about 7%. And sure, you can look here at the differing levels. So of course, development partners, ACR, who I used to work for, aid programs of national governments, development banks, etc. Of course, their expenditure in these kind of areas is at a greater level than others. They're driving that change. But what's critical is I guess the underinvestment in this space, particularly if we look at future food systems. Now, I want to refer to another piece of evidence, and really this is just to draw a linkage. So as well as doing that baseline understanding of the level of investment that's occurring in developing economies in innovation, we then looked at the Commission looked at a piece of work that analysed 1.2 million citations from the CABI database. So it was really just looking at where the research outputs are occurring. Now, we haven't done the direct correlation, but you can see a very strong correlation between where the investment is occurring in innovation, which you saw earlier, and where the investment's occurring in agriculture, so principally dominated by China, India, Brazil, etc., and where we're seeing the outputs, the research outputs. Now, I'm not advocating that the citations in a CABI database directly correlate with the level of innovation occurring. But it is, I guess, a proxy because, that underpinning evidence is needed to drive that innovation. So we're seeing here a correlation, therefore, between the investment that's occurring and where those research outputs are occurring. Now, what we also did with that analysis across those 1.2 million citations, we looked at not only the geographical spread of those citations, but we looked at where the focus was in those areas. And maybe this is a bit too small, but it looked across technology areas, ecosystem areas, and socio-economic. Now, this is 2,600 articles versus 80,000. So what the message is here is still a vast amount of the investment that's going into driving research outputs as significantly focused around those technology issues and not necessarily balanced across those areas of the environment through ecosystem services and other socio-economic issues as well. And if we further break that down, and so this is now just taken in the technology investment area, which you saw earlier was the vast majority of where that evidence, that research evidence is coming through. What we also see is strong inclusion in terms of economic growth and more about the health of the planet. And so that's a good thing to address climate change in the future. But there are the Commission was concerned about some underinvestment in areas around healthy people and particularly in terms of inclusivity. Now, just a note on inclusivity, yes, gender's been a main focus and should continue to be a main focus, but the Commission was also interested in expanding what inclusivity means, not just being about gender, but being about caste, different positions in the system, etc., the different power structures that relate. So the message here is that when we look at that level of investment, strong in terms of technology areas to drive economic growth, but perhaps not as balanced as it should be in terms of those other areas. Now, just reflect on the time that it takes from this research that's occurring in the field in research areas in terms of the time to impact. So we've got to take into account the lag that was there. So just to wrap that bit up, so underinvestment in innovation, very much focused on technology and the economics, geospatially variable. And what this does is it really creates some limitations in terms of the ability to scale innovations in those developing economies, which is, I guess, and the reason I put that in there is that it was a key focus of the Commission, how to get innovations at scale within those developing economies. So then I just wanted to reflect a little bit on some efforts that are being made to rebalance this. So not only efforts of the Commission, but other efforts that are going on. So this is the first piece. Now, if I was to recommend any reading, so there'd be, this has recently come out, which is a really insightful piece of work from the World Bank and from IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute, which is part of the CG. So I'd encourage people to have a look at it, or at least read the blogs, etc., associated with it. So this is some modelling that was done. So what the model has looked at is, so the time frame here is 2040. So we've moved on past the SDGs of 2030. So we're looking at a 2040 time frame. And they modelled 7 different scenarios. And I'm only going to talk about 2 of those scenarios, and I'm only going to talk about it briefly. But I'd encourage people to have a look at it. So the first scenario they modelled is business as usual. So if we kept doing what we're doing in agricultural subsidies, so that's public policy support, of which it's very large, 639 billion currently across the globe. If we kept doing the same thing, business as usual scenario, what would happen? So don't worry too much about the numbers. The message here is that we would continue to feed the world, so that's a good thing. But the contribution of emissions from agriculture would double. Okay, so that's basically to do the inefficiencies of those agricultural subsidies, both domestic support and barriers that occur at the national border. So agriculture would continue, we'd feed the world, perhaps continue to feed it in a reasonable way, but the emissions from agriculture would double. Okay, so then they looked at a whole range of different scenarios of repurposing that public expenditure. I'm not going to worry too much about that. There are variable differences within those scenarios. But the last one, they modelled what they refer to as green innovation. So green innovation, that contributes to ongoing productivity growth, but at the same time reduces emissions from agriculture. Okay, so it's having that dual purpose. So what the modelling said was that if we spent 1% of agricultural GDP on green innovations, so remember at the moment we're spending about 4.5% of agricultural GDP. So if we upped it by 1% on green innovations, we'd have a particular impact. Now, the thing to remember here, so the key message, 1, we continue to feed the world. So that's a good thing. And that's, what we've always been focused on in technology and innovation. But what's important to me, and I guess what's important as we, think about future food systems and the cost of those food systems, if we were to allocate that funding to green innovations, what the modelling suggests through until 2040 is that emissions from agricultural or agri-food systems would come down by about 40%, significantly good thing. But I think the other really important contribution is that what the modelling suggests is that 105 million hectares of land in agriculture in 2040, not in agricultural now, in agriculture in 2040, would be converted back to nature. And as the contribution from agriculture, a significant amount comes from land use change, that's a really significant effort that goes here. So the modelling is suggesting this utilisation of green innovations, productivity growth, and also the reduction of emissions is a really beneficial thing. Continue to feed the world, and they also do some modelling that healthier diets would be cheaper, etc., etc. Don't worry too much about that bit. I encourage you to read the report. However, just to point out that the distribution of that public policy is geospatially variable as well. So again, another big expenditure from China, and then significant contribution from the EU as well. And I'm going to turn to the EU because this section's about what we're trying to do. Now, I'm a bit naive about this. In all of the presentations, this slide's the one I know least about. So forgive me. But what we know is that from an EU perspective, what they're trying to move towards is the EU's Green Deal. And I suspect lots of people have heard about it, and we're still trying to work out what it is. But it's moved the EU from in the 70s, where they were sort of interested in climate change, a cause and effect, a linear relationship, and trying to turn the policy lever to affect that one thing, pollution, etc. In the 90s, where they were a bit more systemic about it. And now in this area, it's much more of a holistic, systematic approach to addressing climate change in the development of the New Deal. But what I see is really interesting, and particularly for sort of this discussion, is the Green Deal's pitched as a growth strategy, an economic growth strategy. Okay, so it's not, that's the way they're contextualizing it within that political landscape. And the other thing about that is that, and I think this is a really important feature, is that they've aligned an investment plan with that. So this kind of thinking about, commercial, business, private sector is quite aligned. And although a significant proportion of the budget will come from national budgets and their contribution to the EU, there is a significant contribution of the $1 trillion that they're organising in terms of from the private sector as well. So the private sector's playing a key part of this. And it's my view is that it's trying to break down the barrier of the private sector investing. The private sector wants to invest where they're at the moment, where there are economic growth opportunities. The one thing that I want to touch on, and this is leading into something else as well in terms of what's happening at the moment, and partially because of my background, I'm always concerned, I guess I'm interested in the ongoing role of international agricultural research. Now, this is just a slide that I actually used some time ago, but I just wanted to put it up in terms of contextualizing the role of international agricultural research in terms of what we're doing. Because being involved with the system for a period of time, it's my view that we're at a point where we'll either, sway towards it's becoming much more relevant or it's becoming much less relevant. And there's plenty of evidence in terms of, from an economic benefit point of view, in terms of the contribution international agricultural research makes. But even with these kind of numbers, we're still having lots of trouble in terms of advocating the ongoing and important role of international agricultural research. And then within that context about what international agricultural research can do, there's also a significant contribution in terms of the private sector. You saw it early on in terms of the contribution they're already making to innovation. But it's my view that they will be critical and become an even more important part of the contribution we globally can make to a transitioning agri-food system. So the private sector already invests more in developed country agri-food systems. And much of the effort that's made, particularly in technology innovations, is about spilling that technology innovation, so therefore the investment from that developing country, that developed country into developing countries. But one of the points I wanted to make here, and look, I've worked in this sort of public good space for a long, long time. It's my view that many of the actors in my space, in international public goods, really need to change their attitudes towards the private sector. And a strong view I have is that those attitudes of development practitioners, the likes of me, that really restrict the contribution that the private sector can make. But when we think about the private sector, yeah, this is a bit of a common message that it's different in regions, okay? So I'll try and explain this. So one of the pieces of work that the Commission did was that after it looked at the baseline of investment, it then looked at what's the investment gap that we need to fill between now and 2030 in investing in innovation that'll feed the world, so contribute to SDG 2, reducing hunger, but also make a significant contribution to the Paris Climate Agreement. Okay, so what the modelling, again, this is modelling through to 2030, suggested was that it's about a $15 billion per annum investment gap. Now, to me, that seems a lot of money, okay? But thinking about some of the numbers that you've seen before in this presentation, one, maybe it's not so much money. And then the other thing, when we presented that figure to the 21 commissioners you saw before, the general thought was, oh, that's far too low. And we can't pitch that to anyone. It's not enough money to pitch in terms of the significance of of the contribution that it makes. But putting that aside, so the investment gap, $15 billion a year in 3 different areas. 1, research and development. 2, scaling climate smart agriculture. 3, improve water management. Okay, and in the R&D bit, it was about $4 billion to be spent on research. But what the modelling suggested was that the contribution in different regions comes from different investors. So remember that sort of pie where it was national governments, private sector, development partners, etc. So in sorry, left-hand side, Latin America and the Caribbean, here South Asia. So in those 2 areas, it's a balanced effort with those different investors contributing in a balanced way. Then in East Asia and the Pacific, so sort of where we're situated, it's much more of an important role for the private sector in terms of the investment needed in research to drive innovation at scale. And then in MENA, Middle East and North Africa, you know, a much stronger contribution from national efforts, and that's where there's some national capability. But here where our concern is, and certainly our international concern around food security and the implications of agri-food systems onto climate change, you know, a much greater effort needed from the international community for sub-Saharan Africa. And so I think it's just, you know, it's my view, it's reflective to look at not only the level of investment, but how that complements each other in different regions. And that's what I wanted to sort of sum up here in terms of complementarity. One apology, you know, all images that you use are meant to be relevant. This was just one I saw on my phone the other day reading the news about this, and you and Ag would have all heard about this, so I won't say anything about it. But I really wanted to use it in my presentation because it's got this, it invokes about innovation, the long-term nature of research, stuff that's a little bit different, blah, blah, blah. And I could have talked about that for a little while. But what I really wanted to highlight here is that as we look at those regional differences and as we look at who's investing in innovation and who's doing it, it's really important to look at it from a complementary point of view. Now, my eyesight's only just good enough, but the ear tag in the cow is, Tony, what would it be? CSIRO. So, you know, it's within a research facility, but what it's promoting is how we take that innovation to scale, potentially through commercial means. But as we do that and as we look to scale innovations, it's about the partnerships that we have in a complementary way. And there's lots of discussion about public and private contributions at a research level. But I think we need to start thinking about at a scaling level as well. It's definitely about, and I guess that the last slide highlights that, in terms of the international, national, local contexts that are really important, how those different partnerships manage risk, and of course, IP is a really important component of that. Sorry, I'm going on a bit long. I've had so much to tell you, so I'll try and wrap it up reasonably quickly. So if we look at the sort of current efforts, the last couple of slides, you know, there's definitely a repurposing of public policy, and it's really to support a just transition. So that's an equitable transition. And now we're starting to see how climate actions link to economic growth strategies, and how we connect those different players internationally, nationally, locally, etc. And so therefore, you know, these efforts in terms of the rebalancing effort is definitely a complementary approach. So now I want to flick to some ideas about some other ideas that we might have that have come from the Commission. So, and there are just a couple that I wanted to outline, so I'll be reasonably quick. So as we move to rebalance the portfolio of investment in this area of agri-food innovation, the Commission developed lots and lots of ideas, and I'm just going to touch on a couple. The first is to develop and I guess adhere to some principles that guide investment and guide the implementation of that investment as well. Now, I'm not going to go through the principles in detail. We can come back to it if you want. But what I was really interested in as these principles were developed, and they were developed with the use of a task force, so like an expert group to develop them up. What I was really interested in is, you know, the principles sort of got not knocked back, and not weakened, but it's a process of consideration. And I guess from a principles point of view, if investors and those implementing these investments are at least considering these approaches that will hopefully rebalance the efforts, then that's a useful thing. So that's the first thing. Maybe look at a set of principles that can guide all of that investment. And in fact, towards the end of the work of the Commission, we actually worked with some national governments in Asia to embed these principles in a couple of areas of work. And that started well. The Commission's now finished, and so we haven't really been able to track how effectively that was implemented. So that's a group of principles. The second is an area sort of to really think about translating that research into impact at scale, because that's really what we want to achieve. And as I mentioned much earlier, there's a long lag time, 30 years in developed economies. But how do we change? How do we hasten that? How do we make it more rapid? But most importantly, how do we make the beneficiary really at the centre of what we're designing? Now, often in the work of agriculture and agricultural research, we think about the end user, the key beneficiary, as the smallholder producer. But what I'm seeing more recently is in the design and in the thinking, we think also about the consumer. And my view is that that's a really important transformation that's occurring, which has been influenced by this sort of value chain thinking, that we think about benefits for not only the smallholder producer, but we think about benefits for the consumer and how the investment in innovation can deliver benefits for both ends of that value chain. The other important point around really being able to translate these innovations at scale is this idea of bundling up innovations. And importantly, when we think of bundling innovations, it makes us think about not only the technological advances and the technology innovations, but it also thinks, and I'll draw on this at the end, about financial innovations, but also about policy innovations. And really the Commission came to the conclusion about how we bundle that technology, the financial instruments, the policy enabling environment, and institutional capacity together was the critical way to drive innovations at scale. But there are lots of factors that have an implication of taking innovation to scale. And due to time, I'll just move over this, but this was really just some insight in terms of different approaches that can be used to take that innovation to scale. Now, I've mentioned technology innovations, and I just wanted to, I guess, end a little bit in terms of financial instruments and innovations in financial instruments, because it was the considered view of the Commission that this is a really important feature that probably doesn't get enough attention at the moment, and particularly doesn't get enough attention at the moment in terms of the critical nature smallholder farmers play at the interface between the livelihoods that they generate from those agri-food systems, the contribution that they make to global food security, but also the critical role they play in managing the environment. Now, what we see is that a very small amount of the green capital that's been generated globally is able to get down to that smallholder level. And it's at that smallholder level that plays such a critical role in terms of those elements, livelihoods for those rural communities, global food security, and also the importance of the management of those ecosystems and the environment. So from the Commission's point of view, in terms of the innovation of financial instruments, it's really important that we think about how those financial instruments get into the hands of the smallholders to be able to deliver those economic, environmental, and social outcomes that we're looking to achieve. And so then just in terms of some ideas from the Commission to wrap that up in terms of rebalancing the portfolio, the critical nature of principles. The work did start with trying to derive principles and metrics. And as with lots of this work in climate, it's crucial that we have metrics that are able to be monitored. So that's really important in terms of guiding investment in innovation. You know, really important that we're designing, so that's bundling and sequencing work that looks at sustainable scaling, not projects. And if you just reflect back on that situation where you saw lots of that investment occurring, that investment's occurring in projects, so contextualized within a time frame. But we've got to think through the long-term nature of getting impact at scale, and think about sustainable impact in the design, not necessarily about designing the best project. And we have to ensure that smallholder farmers in the developing context have available not only those innovative technologies, but the financial instruments and also that policy enabling environment that enables those innovations to go to scale. With that, having taken far too long, thanks very much. Happy to take questions from the audience live or from online. Or I'm happy not to do any questions whatsoever.
There we go. That's working. Cool. I'll pass it over. Make sure you're on the right thing.
Thanks, Pete. Thanks, Dave. Very thought-provoking, and I'm glad you mentioned disparate boxes, because you had me thinking about that earlier in your presentation when you were talking about 30-year time frames and methane emissions. And I think Asparagopsis is a great example. I reviewed a paper on methane emissions pathways for the red meat industry the other day, and I thought, this is fantastic, the science is sound, but I can't see it embedded in our production systems for probably at least another 10 years and maybe 20 or 30, as you suggested, for the developing countries. But what fascinates me with your interest in the public and the private sector and different funders, and as you alluded to a few times, the 30-year time frame, how those different interests and funders are involved over that time period. And you pointed out that the initial work on Asparagopsis was done by CSIRO and a couple of the universities, and we see that for a lot of innovations, the grunt work, the really tricky fundamental stuff is done early on, but probably not much commercial benefit. And now we're seeing, you know, the venture capital investment funds circling. I know they're interested in Asparagopsis, and CSIRO has been quite proactive in actually creating their own startup called FutureFeed in combination with MLA and a couple of the other universities. So CSIRO have secured the IP over Asparagopsis, and they want to actually commercialise it themselves, rather than, I guess, taking a more traditional approach where the private sector, your Bayers, Monsantos, will do the applied research and commercialise it. So I wondered about your thoughts on all of that. You know, how do we ensure that the public institutions who do the initial grunt work get rewarded commercially for their investment?
Yeah, excellent question, Michael. So I feel like being Tony Jones on Q&A and say, I'll just take that as a comment, but I won't, I'll comment on it. So the first thing, often we think about those pathways as quite linear. okay? And I think that's a fault right from the beginning, okay? Because it continues to emphasize that the risk of that early stage high rate of failure is taken on by, you know, public institutions and not taken on across the broader innovation pathway. So I think there's a failure in that linear approach. I think we've started to break down the barriers a bit in terms of, you know, we're not too held into, well, you know, this blue sky research happens at this institute funded by public money, and then it's getting to applied stage and developing, etc. But I think there's still a long way to go in breaking that down. And often it's about the long-term nature of that investment that's needed and getting buy-in throughout that linear process, not just enabling one institution to take on the risk. It's very difficult, and I'm not creating an example of where there's, you know, success in that, but we do have to continue to break down those design approaches that we use that are quite linear in nature, and think about how we can include, I guess, the risk capital upfront from those different stakeholders.
Thanks, Dave.
But probably the most challenging, that's the question that's the most challenging in this space.
Yeah.
So we've got two questions online. First one, Kathleen wanted to know, she said she missed just a little bit of your talk. What elements are you researching for your PhD?
So it's not my PhD, it's some previous work that I've been involved with.
Previous work you've been involved in. Okay, there you go. Thanks.
You should have come to my thesis proposal review if I wanted.
That one's from Kathleen. And we had, Roger wanted to ask a question directly. So I'm just going to bring up his mic. So he should be able to.
Hello, can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can just hear you.
Yeah, thanks very much for the presentation, David. It raises so many questions, and in particular, looking at the more macro perspective of what's happening with the investment in agri-foods here and innovation. Just two comments really that strike me. One is that you mentioned at the very end the importance of metrics. I'm a sustainability accountant, and we always regard sustainability accounting as an administrative innovation. So it adds nicely into the notion of innovation. Sustainability accounting is a way of providing information which helps all the different parties and stakeholders become aware of the various social, environmental and economic issues and how to deal with trade-offs. There's a long literature in that. And I was just thinking that might help. I just wondered also whether you're thinking here about how you might actually apply your knowledge in a particular country. I know you're focusing on the global south, but if, for example, I just took Australia, which might be useful, I wonder whether you thought about the portfolio aspect of your investment. So, for example, if I look at who operates on or owns or controls land in Australia, I would see, yes, you've got the private sector, the companies, you've got public sector, the government, you've also got an indigenous sector, and you've got people who are tenanting. And I just wonder whether within this, you could work out how the money that you're discussing might be available to help in research and also help small farmers could be made a little bit more granular, say a little bit more focus on helping indigenous areas where the agriculture might need more money, or the perhaps tenanted people where there's perhaps less incentive to invest. So just those two things, sustainability accounting and the nature of the portfolios that you're looking at.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, really interesting question. So from a sustainability accounting perspective, definitely the Commission recognised the important role of metrics within that, but I guess we're hamstrung by the challenges of developing metrics. And if we look at RED Plus from a long time ago, there are those challenges there, and so I won't go into that detail. And then from a portfolio approach and sort of contextualising it. Yeah, look, I totally agree with sort of the inference that you're making in terms of the importance of contextualising it. The work of the Commission really just brought together some, as Michael pointed out in the commentary, some things to sort of get you thinking about it. But this work will be effective when it is done at that granular level within particular contexts. And I think it has lots of relevance. And I guess just a little plug. So what we've done with the work of the Commission, we've taken that and we've actually developed a masterclass for investors in innovation, and that's being supported by the Crawford Fund, and we'll pilot it with APARI, which is the Asia Pacific Association of Agricultural Research Institutes in Asia at the end of July. And the whole idea of that masterclass is to take this broad understanding or broad evidence base and enable those participants who are policymakers, philanthropic investors, private sector investors, utilise that evidence and knowledge to put it in the context so their investment in innovation can have that greater impact. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, David. Just in terms of my thoughts there, it'd be really good to see an application, say in Bangladesh, where they have phenomenal problems with agriculture and annual flooding and so on, and desertification in the north. So applying it, it'd be really great to see an application. And the second point is that you might be aware that the British have been doing something on this with the British Farming Initiative, they call it, where they give money to various types of owners and controllers of land to bring about sustainable farming, and they give money per hectare, depending on the type of land as well, and the nature of control over the land that's there. So really good, and I'd like to encourage you further with this.
Yeah, all right, thanks. And yeah, look, lots of different nationally based policies that are, having an influence on how the future food system is going to transform. So I agree with that. All right, why don't I just say thanks to everyone. So thanks for coming. Really great that you've been involved. Thanks, everyone. Cheers.